Hello there. Welcome to another online literary lunch presented by the Authors Club. I'm John Walsh, I'm president of the club, and it's my great good fortune today to talk to Alex Christofi about his book Dostoevsky in Love and Intimate Life. Now, Alex has a serious day job as the editorial director of Transworld Publishers, a division of Penguin Random House, but he's also an established author in his own right before his new book. He's written two novels. The first, Glass, is a comic picaresque tale of a German oddball who becomes that rare thing, a celebrity window cleaner. It won the Betty Trask Prize for a debut fiction. It was followed by Let Us Be True, an intense and moving love story in which German-born Ralph and Elsa meet in a Paris that's struggling to recover from the Second World War. Now Alex has published a highly unusual piece of life writing. Fyodor Dostoevsky was, of course, one of the titanic figures of the 19th century world literature, the author of The Idiot, The Devils, and The Brothers Karamazov. I'm sure many of us still recall the shock of first reading those long, charged, torrential, semi-hysterical descriptive passages and those pages and pages of slightly deranged conversations in Crime and Punishment when Raskolnikov is about his business. James Joyce called the author the man who has created modern prose and intensified it to its present-day pitch. There have been several lives of Dostoevsky. One of them, by Joseph Frank, is 2,500 pages long, but Alex's book isn't a biography in the strict sense. What he's done is, in effect, to construct Dostoevsky's autobiography for him. But let's ask the author to explain. Alex, how would you describe this book?
Yeah, I suppose it comes down into the category of creative non-fiction. As you say, there've been other biographies, and so the challenge for me was to try to find a way of writing about Dostoevsky that would feel like it was adding something rather than simply sort of bowdlerizing others' work. I suppose the thing I really wanted to answer was what it was like to be Dostoevsky. And so, it's subtitled An Intimate Life, and it does talk about his intimate relationships, as you might expect. But I wanted the narratorial voice to be intimate as well, and for it to be quite almost kind of free and direct in the way that you might expect with a novel. So, if, for instance, Dostoevsky finds Turgenev pretentious and fey, that was how he would be portrayed in the book. So I wanted to sort of be true to the spirit of how he saw the world, I suppose.
Right. And how close did Dostoevsky come to writing his own memoir?
He actually did try, and he wanted to. He was prompted as he rose to not just to prominence, but really to sort of the status of a national prophet towards the end of his life. A journalist asked him to write a short memoir for a series he was doing, a guy called Pyotr Bykov, and he sort of tried and put it to one side and didn't quite manage it. I slightly suspect he thought that by that point he was self-publishing quite and making quite good money doing so. So I slightly suspect he took the idea and thought he might, put the guy off and do it himself. Mm-hmm. But there's this great entry in one of his notebooks. It was Christmas Eve 1877. He was kind of taking stock of his life. It was the 28th anniversary of having been driven off to Siberia. Mm. And he wrote down 4 things he wanted to do with the rest of his life. One of them was he wanted to write a Russian Candide. The third one on the list was that he wanted to write his memoirs. Mm-hmm. And it's quite sadly, he says, but I think this will all take me 10 years and I'm already 56. And, he had very poor health throughout his life. So he was sadly quite pessimistic that he would ever get it done, and he didn't manage it.
Right. Of course, you started your career writing fiction. Were you not tempted to turn the inner thoughts of Fyodor into a novel, like J.M. Coetzee, I think, had a go at doing that? Why wouldn't that have been easier than, as it were, skimming bits of autobiography off the voluminous writings?
Yeah, I know what you mean. And actually, I did talk to the publisher about this. I think, I suppose that the thing for me was that I think the best quotes in the book are from Dostoevsky, written by him. I'm sort of creating an architecture to sort of show off some of his best writing and some of his best ideas. And it would have seemed to me disingenuous to kind of claim it all for myself, I suppose. And in that way, I thought it would be what made it such an interesting tightrope walk with nonfiction. Obviously, on the one hand, you have the injunction not to plagiarize, and on the other, it has to be original or that it's not worth writing.
Yeah.
And that was sort of, for me, part of what made it an interesting performance, I suppose, the tension of whether I would or wouldn't be able to kind of get away with it. Certainly that was what helped spur me to keep doing my research. But it was, I mean, an interesting point actually is that it's going to be published in the Russian language, and they're publishing it as a novel.
Goodness.
I think it's easier to do it as a novel there because people are so familiar with his work that I think they'll know what comes from Dostoevsky and what comes from Alex.
That's okay. That's going to be very weird, isn't it? It's going to have passages in Dostoevsky's Russian and yours, and how peculiar. Gosh. Well, let's get on with the book itself. Could you the kind of person he was when young? Can you describe for us the young Fyodor in his 20s and give us a brief medical report on his medical condition, which is so fascinating?
Yeah, he's so in his early 20s, he'd been sent to an engineering academy in St. Petersburg by his father, who was absolutely determined that he was going to have a good, solid job. His mother had died when he was 15, and sadly his father was possibly murdered when he was about 20. So at this point he had a few older relatives living a few hundred miles away. He was pretty much left to his own devices, and he quickly quit his engineering job. He really, really knew he wanted to be a writer from a very young age. And so he was terrible with money. He was kind of constantly, if he got any, he would, pay someone to tell him their interesting story, or he would lose it all at billiards. You suspect from certain veiled references in his letters that he may have been spending some of it at brothels. And on top of all this, he was not a very well young man, even from a very early age. He seemed to have some sort of nervous condition, and it wasn't really pinned down until later in his life. But we now know he probably had temporal lobe epilepsy, and there's a specific kind called Gershwin syndrome, which is basically the symptoms are Dostoevsky's personality. It's, hyper verbose, very religious.
Yeah.
What's characterized as atypical sexuality. You wonder slightly whether the tail's wagging the dog, because I wonder whether Gershwin took Dostoevsky as his model, but yeah.
Atypical sexuality, does that mean anything in particular?
Well, I mean, it's difficult to speculate when it comes to Dostoevsky. We do know that he certainly had multiple relationships across his life. It's not uncommon. He seemed to fantasize quite passionately about people's feet. And there are a number of passages inked out in his letters to his second wife, Anna, which haven't yet been decoded. I think you probably could decode them with photospectrometry, but then you need the funds to do so.
We'll never know. Maybe we'll never know about his obsession with his wife's feet. That's fantastic. He was, yes, of course, what the trouble was his epilepsy. He discovered he had epilepsy on his wedding night. Isn't that right? Talk about pre-wedding nerves. And they did coincide, didn't they?
They did. I mean, I think so he had fits before this. Freud was very influential in how people saw this after the fact, but because he argued there was this kind of intense relation between his sexuality and his mental condition.
Yeah,
he had a fit, for instance, when he was in Siberian prison about 3-4 years earlier. But it was, I mean, the point is that he didn't know. It wasn't diagnosed to him and confirmed that it was epilepsy. Well, after his wedding night, he was told in no uncertain terms that any day of his life he could have a very severe epileptic fit, and that might be the last day of his life. So that was when the sword of Damocles was sort of hanging over him psychologically, I suppose.
When he started, well, let me put it this way, an extraordinary aspect of his writing career was the speed at which he was successful and the speed at which he fell from grace about 15 days later, I think. Can you talk us through that weird period?
Yeah, so he he basically got everything that he'd ever dreamed of straight away. He worked on a first novel called Poor Folk, and he rewrote it about 3 times and tried to make it word perfect, which he didn't really have the opportunity to do for almost any of his work across his life. This was a bit of a one-off, and you feel it. It's very well crafted, actually. It's not his best work, but it is very sort of tight in a way you don't necessarily associate with Dostoevsky. He gave it to, he really wanted to get it published in a journal, and he gave it to his flatmate who kind of knew a guy who was, he was one of the leading critics at one of the leading journals. Mm-hmm. They took it off one evening. Fyodor went out drinking. He came home at 4 a.m. and this critic bursts in the door and with tears in his eyes and hugs him and says, "This is a work of genius. You're a genius. You're the most exciting young writer in Russia." He then took, basically once they'd got some sleep, only a few hours later, they took it to Belinsky, who was literally the foremost critic in Russia, who also heralded him as a genius. Yeah. So it was scheduled for publication, I think, on the January edition of one journal. It was the Petersburg Miscellany. Over the time it took to sort of prepare publication, he wrote a new book, The Double, which it does sort of borrow from kind of very Gogolian themes. And in that way, I suppose it's more derivative and it's less of the social novel that Belinsky really wanted to see. That was published about, as you say, about 2 weeks later. And everyone sort of turned on him. He was brought into this literary circle, and then they started writing mocking poems about him and making snide comments behind his back, and he ended up falling in with a more dangerous literary circle quite soon after that.
Right. So it was literally an overnight success. I think you say that.
Yeah.
Literally in the middle of the night. It's funny. The whole business of the magazines is absolutely fascinating. It seems all these huge books started out being published in magazines, but they had this weird political component to them. They weren't just literary. Can you explain the importance of literary cultural magazines in the mid-19th century Russia and how they intersected with politics, and how he could get from submitting pieces to a mag to facing a firing squad?
Yeah, so the journals maybe they don't quite map onto what we think of as literary magazines, because they basically constituted the public life of Russia. There was censorship, so you couldn't discuss everything, but they were seen as being one of the only real outlets for culture to be disseminated. And if the successful things that were serialized were then published as volumes in the way that we would expect books to be. So they kind of constituted the public life of Russia, and particularly after the new Tsar came in, Alexander II, he explicitly said, we want to kind of open things up and people are allowed to discuss things like, what do we want the future direction of Russia to be? That was when you start getting the really exciting kind of golden period of Russian literature with with Crime and Punishment and Fathers and Sons and so on. Back when he was a young man, it was still quite dangerous to talk about even things that the Tsar had mentioned himself, things like emancipating the serfs.
Yeah.
The crime that he was officially locked up for, and subjected to a mock execution first, was literally just reading out a letter from Belinsky to Gogol saying, you need to be more political. You need to talk about the plight of the serfs in your writing, and it's a shame that you don't do so. It wasn't a particularly controversial letter, and he read it out at a private dinner, and that was the thing that had him sent away for 10 years to Siberia.
And what was the charge exactly? Treachery?
It was effectively sedition. It was,
Right.
disseminating seditious material through the medium of a dinner.
Yes, where one of his associates was a grass to the authorities. Yeah, but this is the beginning of an absolutely terrible period when he was in prison in Siberia for years, and it became was the House of the Dead, I think, wasn't it? That he wrote about that. But generally speaking, your book is so fast, and it's things happen at such astonishing speed. It's it is dizzy making. Dostoevsky's life, his lived experience, as we say nowadays, I believe, was crammed with misery, with near-death experiences, with terrible reversals of fortune. We mentioned the mock firing squad, his incarceration in a forced labor camp, but he was always broke. He gambled his wealth away over and over again. He was swindled by unscrupulous publishers. His children died young. And unlike Tolstoy or Turgenev, who lived calm and settled lives, he was always rushing about in torment. I mean, was he just terribly unfortunate, Alex, or was he a victim of the times he lived in, would you say?
I think it is a combination of both. He was, I mean, so by any measure, he was an incredibly unlucky person.
Yeah.
You know, he was orphaned at quite a young age. You know, they scraped together all the money they had to buy a not very successful estate with 100 serfs, and that burnt down after 2 years. You know, the peasants were unfortunately having to take the thatch off their roofs to feed the animals. You know, there were certain circumstances. The people he loved most very often died far too young, whether that was his first wife, his brother, who he lent on hugely for emotional support. As you say, his two of his four children died before they lived. One died before she lived for a year, and the other died when he was 3 or 4.
Mm-hmm.
That said, that there is this other layer of kind of, I guess, recklessness. I think he felt the need to place himself in precarious positions.
Yeah.
There's, I think, a very telling line in The Idiot where a character talks about when they've been put in some sort of unusually shameful position, that they're kind of at their lowest ebb and nothing can get worse. There's a sort of perverse elation in feeling that every second counts and that every ruble counts and so on. And I kind of think that was part of what led him to the roulette table, the feeling of heightened sense, I suppose.
Yeah. Wasn't there a kind of self-destructive streak though in him when fate wasn't screwing him around? Was he seemed to embrace tragedy and trauma, and the gambling table is the perfect place to do that, of course.
Yeah, I think he equate. I think in a way that we probably find quite hard to understand, or certainly at least troubling in the modern day. I think he really equated suffering to meaning. I think he found it difficult to believe in a world where you didn't have to suffer for what was meaningful in life, whether it was love or whether it was your belief system,
Yeah.
political, religious. You know, I think suffering was a huge part of his theological outlook, and it's slightly hard for us to understand. But I think probably it's just that at the human level, the kind of more universal level, it's that feeling that when you're placed in a precarious position, you don't take anything for granted. I think that feeling of habit, he strongly disliked. Even in his more stable years, he'd spend the summer in Bad Ems, or he'd go to Stara Rosa or somewhere. You know, he didn't like to be still.
Yes, yes. Now you mentioned the theological aspect of his writing. In the Idiot, of course, is a picture of basically a Christian, a super Christian figure, somebody entirely good, entirely wonderful. But this is an identification with Christ, which also meant suffering as well, I suppose. But can you talk us through what he was up to in The Idiot, which is my favorite book, and I think his own favorite. What was he trying to do exactly in that book?
Yeah, he wrote in a letter about 8 or 9 years after the publication of The Idiot. He didn't get everything out exactly how he'd wanted to, and he wanted to go back and revise the text. He didn't find the time, but he always thought people who found The Idiot his best work, he always had a special sympathy towards, because it was really trying to express something that was quite personal to him, I suppose. Yeah, he wanted to portray a perfectly beautiful man, and I think that began with in his early drafting, he talked about this figure as a kind of Prince Christ, and at the simplest level, I suppose it's almost a thought experiment of, you know, if a Christ-like figure were to come to modern day Petersburg of the 1860s,
Yeah.
How would he fare? Would he be treated well? Would he actually be able to get by? It throws up this conflict between what we should theoretically be doing and what it is to live in the world. My sense is that the artist in him slightly struggled against the theologian. So you have this fascinating conflict in the book where, on the one hand, you really want this idealistic figure to end up having a happy life and for things to kind of work out because he's a good person and he tries his best.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, the realist in Dostoevsky kind of can't let him be happy because he's exactly the kind of person who would be tricked into bad situations and end up in, being the victim of violence and so on.
Yes.
So I think that was an incredibly creative tension for Dostoevsky.
Yeah.
He was writing it in very straitened and kind of tragic circumstances, effectively in exile, exiled by his debt
In Switzerland.
Europe.
In Switzerland, yeah.
Yeah, he was in Switzerland.
It is well, when I was reading, when I was young, it was a truism to say that because of this tension you were talking about between the artist and the believer, he didn't know what his own hero was going to do in circumstances. So he couldn't plot the book because he didn't know, as he was writing about it, what his character was going to do. Is that right? Is that accurate?
There's a line in one of his letters contemporaneous to the drafting of the first section where he's sort of half joking. He says, maybe he'll develop under my pen. I think basically the problem was he wanted to write about Russia and the future of the Russian people.
Mm-hmm.
To do that, he had to get back to Russia. To get back to Russia, he had to write a successful book. And he had to do it fast. He didn't have any, he wasn't using up savings to write the book to earn a lot of money. He was writing on advances from the publisher Katkov, who would send him 300-400 rubles at a time. And Dostoevsky gambled most of it away. He was beginning to be in debt with the grumpy old Swiss lady they were boarding with.
Yeah.
And there was lots of expenses associated with staying on the move, with the funeral of their first child. So I think if he'd had a year to prepare it, as he did for the Brothers Karamazov, it would probably be a very different book.
Yeah. Okay, I'm intrigued. Why did you call the book Dostoevsky in Love? Why did you home in on that? Because his first two brushes with love weren't romantic triumphs, were they?
No, that's true.
Could you talk us through what went wrong briefly?
I quite well. So at the sort of structural level, I suppose the artist in me really liked this idea that there were really three great loves, and two of them were absolute duds, and the third was a total triumph. But I think they sort of structure his life really well because his first love is the kind of classic romantic archetype with a big R of, she's very pale and she has consumption and is fiery eyes and a mean temper. And his second great love, Polina, is a young student nihilist who sort of wants to talk about politics and be emancipated and travel around Europe, making great comebacks to the great and good of the world.
She drove him as well. She drove him around.
Yeah.
Didn't she? Yeah.
One of the very few people that could dominate Dostoevsky, actually. And then his third love really was the thing he'd been hoping for, which was a stable Christian family setup. Yeah, Anna was incredibly supportive. So I thought that gave it a good structure. But I suppose there was a sort of second layer of wanting to describe the importance of compassion in his work, the Christian love.
Yeah. Can you talk us about the circumstances of the gambler? Because the lovely Anna Grigorievna Snitkina, she came in as a 20-year-old stenographer. Could you just tell us what he was up against with the gambler in terms of the time he had to write it, the guy who was driving him round the twist, the publisher. It's such a weird time. And in the middle of this trauma is this wonderful love affair. Can you just give us a moment on that? Or three?
Yeah. So he was, after his brother died, he didn't have to, but he agreed for his in-laws' sake to take on all of his older brother's debts. which amounted to about 20,000 rubles. So we're talking about,
much?
it's hard to estimate, but we're probably hundreds of thousands of pounds in
Jesus.
today's money for what you could get for it. He had this huge amount of debt. He also had, in terms of actually what he physically had in hand to live off, almost nothing. So around the time he knew he wanted to write Crime and Punishment, he also did a sort of side deal to write a little novella for a guy called Dostoevsky. He had to deliver it in 1 year, otherwise he would lose all his copyrights to his work.
Who signed the contract saying that? It's absolutely extraordinary.
He basically, the guy promised him 3,000 rubles up front, and he didn't have any other offers coming in, and he just decided to take it. I think he'd had a similar deal with another organization before that they never enforced, and on gentlemen's agreements, people never really enforce these sorts of terms. The difference was about 10 months in, it got to the summer, and he went over to Dostoevsky and said, "Look, I've been writing this other book. I haven't even written a word of the Gambler. Just give me an extension, 3 months extension. I can get it done for you." And Dostoevsky said, "I have absolutely no intention of doing that. I want your copyrights. This is all, for me, a ploy to get your copyrights. I don't care about you."
Shocking, staggering.
It came out afterwards that Dostoevsky was the one who bought Fyodor's debt in order to tried to basically force him to enter into the agreement in the first place. A really nasty guy. So he had a bit of a war council with his fellow writers, who suggested they could break it up into bits because he knew the plot of the book he was going to write. And Dostoevsky said, "No, I want, my work's my work. Thanks, but no thanks." So the second suggestion was to get a stenographer.
Right.
He ended up working.
He had 3 months to write the whole novel. Is that right?
Well, by this point, he actually then carried on writing Crime and Punishment for 2 months.
Okay.
So he had 1 month. Anna arrived at his door pretty much a month to the day before its deadline.
Mm-hmm.
And they worked day and night on the book. They would basically dictate all across the evening. Anna would come back in the morning with the typewritten, the handwritten pages. And they'd start on the next section. And along the way, Dostoevsky, in their tea breaks, he kind of talked about his life up to that point, and they got to know each other. And he found himself falling in love. So on the very final day when they were the final day of the deadline, Dostoevsky went to deliver the book to Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky wasn't in. The manager of the publishing house refused to accept receipt of the manuscript because he said he wasn't authorized to do so, in kind of classic Russian fashion. He ended up taking legal advice and getting a receipt from the local police station about 10 p.m. on the day.
Oh my God, 2 hours.
With 2 hours to the deadline. So he just got in under the wire.
All his works, all the rights to his works were worked to this guy. My God.
I think in the elated aftermath, they were all kind of drinking champagne, and Dostoevsky was looking across at Anna and asked if he could see her again, even though they'd finished work, visit her family house. And she said it was a Sunday, and she said, "What about Thursday?" And he said, "Oh, Thursday's too long to wait, And eventually he proposed by suggesting that he had a new book coming, which was about a sick old man who couldn't offer anything to this beautiful young woman, and did she think it was a realistic plot? And she said, "Oh yes, very realistic, bless her." And he said, "Well, what if he was me and you were her?" And she said, "I'd love you for the rest of my life."
My God, I think I've something in my eye, Alex. Good Lord. Yes, you don't. Some people, well, people say you don't write enough about theology. You don't. You could have written. The book could be twice as long if you'd written about the plots and about the characters, exactly what's going on, and imagine you writing on the brothers Karamazov. Did you make a conscious decision not to go for too much lit crit?
Yeah, I suppose it was. One of my models for the book was Limonov by Emmanuel Carrère. I really like the idea of following a person's life as a way to evoke the spirit of the times. And obviously, you know, in France, it doesn't really matter if something sort of fiction or non-fiction. They don't really, you know, I think it was published as a novel, but it's pretty clearly a biography.
Yeah.
And so I just thought that was a really interesting approach. I mean, I think in retrospect, I think every biographer is somewhat reacting against previous biographers' efforts. And I think in recent decades, you know, you've had brilliant works, but not least by Joseph Frank, but by Rowan Williams. You know, most of them focusing, I would say, on his intellectual contributions, his work as a philosopher,
Yeah.
his contribution to religion. So I suppose in some way, it was the pendulum swinging. I wanted to portray a Dostoevsky that was embodied and that was, you know, in some ways he's quite earthy, and the body is it's not the only aspect of his work, but it's one of the sort of, you know, the spirit and the body is one of the axes on which he operates. So
Yeah.
I felt it was a kind. I suppose I was trying to write a corrective rather than a definitive biography.
Right. Can you tell us, we're heading towards the end, I think, now, a bit, the reasons why things changed for him? I mean, he started out he starts out in disarray, doing with nothing particularly, and he ends up as a kind of hero who is invited to tea with the Tsar's children. He was faced in the streets of St. Petersburg as a kind of prophet and a hero. How did he manage to have this apotheosis at the end of his life in the 1880s, and how had Russia changed to make this happen?
I think it was partly that Alexander II had explicitly tabled the question of what do we want the future of Russia to be like. He'd done so, I think, to try to calm down the kind of boiling resentments among the intelligentsia. You know, the beginnings of a very revolutionary socialism. It didn't work. I mean, there were multiple attempts on his life.
Yeah.
But you know, you have this flourishing of literary culture, which allows for a voice in the way that, you know, there was a kind of golden age for Shakespeare in England, maybe. So it was partly the context that allowed for a literary flourishing. People felt very uncertain in the 1870s, and I think they were looking for someone to sort of tell them what Russia's future was. And
Yes.
Dostoevsky was very proudly Russian, and he saw a future for Russia kind of at the center of world culture, that he felt it was this sort of crucible that could unify world cultures because it had a bit of the East, a bit of the West, and it was also truly unique. He kind of thought it was like the third Rome. You know, this was going to be the seat of worldly power in a way. So he was sort of telling the Russian people what they wanted to hear on that level. I don't go into it in huge depth in the book, but his writer's diary was a journal written solely by him that was very, very popular at the time, and it contributed hugely to his success. And that was pretty jingoistic, you know, for modern sensibilities. So there was that, but it was also, I think, the kind of cumulative impact of his work. There were a lot of people who seemed to be writing things that were very perceptive at the time that dated badly, and actually his intellectual project seemed to kind of gather pace over the course of his life.
And the brothers Karamazov, his great masterpiece, how did that contribute to this feeling of him being a prophet? Or was it more the diary, but with the big novel? How did that hit the public's imagination?
I think that was the culminating achievement of his life. I suppose what it did was it unified his vision in a book that almost portrayed a whole Russian world across its pages, and it created some of the most iconic scenes in Russian literature. You know, you can't read The Grand Inquisitor and not just throw your hands up and accept that he's one of the great writers in world literature.
Right.
So it coincided very neatly with a festival to celebrate Pushkin, who Dostoevsky loved, and he gave a very powerful speech there. And someone literally went out to the shops and got a laurel wreath to put on him. And at that point, everyone agreed he was the national prophet.
That's fantastic. The laurel wreath, like a Roman victor after a battle. Fantastic.
Yeah, although in a sort of Gogolian fashion, it was far too large. The only one they could seemingly find was about 1.5 meters wide. So I think they sort of put it around him like a what Miss World sash. I don't know.
Imagine. I think we've had our time. Could you just two things quickly?
Yeah.
When I was writing a review of your book the other day, people were saying to me, "This sounds so fab. Where would you advise new readers to start out in the oeuvre of Fyodor?" As people are asking me, where would you have people start?
I think if you want to read a well-crafted, linear, suspenseful novel, I think Crime and Punishment is a great place to start, particularly the Oliver Ready translation, which I think is beautifully done.
Right.
If you're looking for something short as a way of dipping your toe in, if you like the absurd kind of the Nikolai Gogol end of the spectrum, I think The Double is a wonderful short. Is probably only 60 pages or so.
Right.
Or Notes from the Underground is very short and super intense. I think you can get a great sense of how original and unique Dostoevsky is from Notes from the Underground.
Great. Okay. You're not recommending Poor Folk, I notice. Is that any good?
I have a bit of a soft spot for Poor Folk, but it is. I mean, it's very out of fashion for our tastes. It's fundamentally a sentimental social novel about a very poor old man who wants to look after a very poor young woman who lives across the courtyard.
God.
And it seems kind of a bit doomed at the start, and it ends doomed. And it's actually, as a piece of writing, it's quite well done, but it probably doesn't match up with most people's tastes these days.
Right. Well, what's your next project? Will you be turning to another biography or going back to fiction, or what?
I'd actually really like to write about Cyprus. I've been my father's from Cyprus, and I think it's a fascinating place, and also gives us a kind of vehicle for discussing these kind of very big questions about history and politics and culture. So I'd like to write about Cyprus next, I think.
Right. Okay, well, I think we have to leave it there. That's all we have time for. The book is called Dostoevsky in Love, An Intimate Life. It's published by Bloomsbury, out in all good bookshops in about a month and a half, I think. And it's highly recommended. And so thanks very much indeed to Alex Christofi for tuning in, or zooming in, and talking to us today. It's been great. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Sure.